Mist clings to the pines at the edge of the Baltic frontier, somewhere ahead. Iron-shod hooves tamp the frozen ground into a dull, rhythmic thunder. You feel the chill creep through wool and leather, and the air tastes like pine resin and nervous sweat. The line in front of you begins to narrow, men and horses compressing into a pointed mass. If you were standing where the enemy stands, watching that black and white wall of riders grow into a moving spear, you probably wouldn't survive, not because fate is dramatic, but because physics is honest. This is the Teutonic Knights Wedge, not a mythic triangle from a manuscript, but a carefully ordered instrument built for one job-breaking people who don't move fast enough. The story really starts with an officially recognized turning point, the Northern Crusades of the 13th century, when the Teutonic Order shifted from a hospitable brotherhood in the Holy Land to a conquering state in Prussia and Livonia. In these campaigns, especially after the capture of Prussian strongholds like Christburg in the 1240s, the order needed a way to punch through tribal infantry in forests and marshland. Their army functioned as a hybrid machine, heavily armored. Knight brothers at the core, supported by half-brothers, mercenary men-at-arms, and a broad base of local levies and crusading guests who arrived seasonally. The wedge was how the elite part of that machine delivered the decisive blow, while the rest held ground, guarded flanks, and finished the rout. Strengths were obvious even to enemies. A narrow front concentrates momentum, letting the best armored riders absorb arrows and spear points while the rear ranks shove forward like a battering ram. But weaknesses lurked inside the geometry. If the point stalled bogged by terrain or disciplined spearmen, the whole formation could bunch up and lose speed. Wedgemen needed more than bravery. They required tight horsemanship, trust in spacing, the ability to keep a straight line while the world shook, and the discipline to ignore personal duels for the unit's tempo. A strange side fact, the order sometimes staged trial charges in camp, lining up posts or shields as mock enemies' early cavalry rehearsal, that some chroniclers found almost theatrical. And as academic debate still circles, historians argue whether the wedge was a uniquely Teutonic innovation, or a standardized European shock tactic refined by the order's monastic drill. Compared to looser night swarms used by many Western armies, this was cavalry behaving less like nobles seeking glory and more like a single, prayed-over weapon. The wedge doesn't form by accident. It's assembled the way a cathedral vault is assembled, stone by stone, rule by rule, except here the stones are horses and men who can panic if you misplace them. Picture the column narrowing into a V, the tip occupied by the most experienced knight brothers, their lances longer and their mounts the freshest. Behind them, ranks widen in measured steps, to riders, then 4, then 6, each file tied to the one ahead like links in a chain. This blueprint becomes visible in accounts of the order's 14th century campaigns in Lithuania, especially the raids of Grand Master Winrich von Niprod in the 1360s-1370s, where chronicles describe charges that bored through pagan lines before infantry closed the trap. These were officially recognized wars of expansion, but tactically they were laboratories. The army functioned with almost bureaucratic clarity. The wedge itself was cavalry shock knight brothers, guest crusaders, and sergeants while mounted. Crossbowmen and lighter Prussian auxiliaries screened ahead, probing for soft spots. Infantry, often German settlers, city militias, or allied locals, followed to hold seized ground and protect the cavalry if the charge had to. Recoil, command, ran down a strict ladder. The Grand Master or Marshal issued the plan. Banner commanders controlled wedges tied to their standards. Within each wedge, veterans at the point kept pace, and everyone behind matched their line like dancers following a lead. Its strength came from order. A wedge is a moving hierarchy. The tip chooses direction. The body supplies force. That means it can punch into a dense mass without dissolving into individual fights. But that same rigor is a weakness when battle stops being neat. If the point is killed, unhorsed, or simply loses sight in dust and snow, the rear ranks may hesitate and sheer outward. Terrain is the other silent enemy. Marshes, felled trees, or a ditch can blunt the spear before it hits. To ride in it, soldiers needed drilled spacing, the nerve to keep knees locked and reins steady while others collide, and the humility to hold formation even when an enemy in front looks like your kill. Lesser-known side fact: the order maintained written ride lists noting which brothers' horses were suited to the front, a kind of medieval performance roster. And as academic debate notes, some scholars see the wedge as just one variant of broader European convoi, while others argue the Teutonic habit of monastic drill made it unusually coherent, closer in spirit to later pike squares than to the freer French night charge. Compared to the swirling cavalry of many contemporaries, this was a geometry you could march to. And then comes the day when geometry meets chaos. July 15, 1410. The Battle of Grunwald-Tannenberg to the Germans spreads across a summer plain in what is now Poland. The Teutonic banners glitter in heat haze, their wedges poised like chisels against a coalition army of Poles, Lithuanians, and allies. This is an officially recognized hinge event. After decades of expansion, the order's military prestige is tested in a single, brutal afternoon, and the wedge is asked to do what it was born to do: shatter a line and decide a war. At first, the army functions almost as doctrine predicts. Teutonic cavalry wedges drive into the Lithuanian wing, pressing hard enough that parts of it fall back. Infantry and crossbowmen support, anchoring positions around the baggage camp and forming a base from which cavalry can reform and strike again. The strength here is textbook shock, narrow points, deep masses, and armored riders forcing a breach by sheer momentum and discipline. The wedge turns speed into pressure and pressure into panic. But Grunwald is not a raid on scattered tribes, it's a chessboard packed with pieces. The coalition's depth absorbs the impact. When the Lithuanians retreat, some sources say it was a feigned retreat, others say a real collapse. The wedges surge forward, stretching their cohesion, pulling away from infantry support. That's the weakness the V-shape hides. Success can tempt the point too far, and a wedge that unpacks itself becomes just riders in a crowd. To survive that moment, wedgemen needed more than the drilled spacing from Section 2. They had to read signals through dust and shouting, resist the urge to chase fleeing enemies, and reform under pressure. The point riders especially needed tactical patience, because even a perfect charge is only a sentence in a longer paragraph. A strange, lesser-known side fact from the battlefield tradition: Teutonic artillery small bombards were present, but reportedly mismanaged, adding noise more than decisive effect. A reminder that the order was experimenting with gunpowder even while leaning on cavalry ideals. And in academic debate, historians still argue whether the wedges failed tactically at Grunwald or were undone by broader operational errors and coalition resilience. Compared to French night charges that often dissolved into personal combat, the Teutonic wedges stayed organized longer, but compared to the more flexible Polish heavy cavalry and Lithuanian light horse, they were less adaptable once the fight stopped following their script. Grunwald didn't kill the wedge, but it exposed its ceiling. After Grunwald's dust settles in the mind, you can't understand the wedge just by watching it strike. You have to step back into the quieter machinery that let the order hurl that spear again and again across decades. Think of the officially recognized siege of Kaunas in 1362, when Teutonic forces pushed deep into Lithuanian territory, hauling timber for fortifications, food for men, and fodder for thousands of horses through hostile forests. A wedge charge is the visible flash. Kaunas is the long inhale before it. The Teutonic army functioned like a traveling city with a monastery's rulebook, supply trains, carts, pack horses, river barges moved under escort. Each brother had assigned servants and squires. Each banner had its own baggage and farriers. Horses were not interchangeable, they were capital. Grain for mounts often mattered more than bread for men, because without fresh horses the wedge is a drawing, not a weapon. The order's network of castles Marienburg, Königsberg, Riga, and a chain of smaller forts worked as relay stations, letting cavalry arrive rested, then reform for sequential assaults. When a wedge hit, there was usually another behind it, because the logistics made repetition possible. That backbone amplified strengths. Discipline wasn't only in the charge but in camp: strict rationing, enforced hierarchy, standardized equipment, and rotating mounts for point riders. It meant the wedge could be deployed on schedule, at speed, with units that knew each other's pace. Yet the same system carried weaknesses. A supply line stretched through marsh and forest is a vein you can cut if scouts failed or locals. Scorched fields, the army slowed, horses weakened, and wedges lost their edge before battle even began. The soldiers' skills here were half battlefield, half management. Knight brothers had to maintain gear, keep mounts healthy, pace themselves during long marches, and still arrive able to ride in tight formation. Lesser-known side fact, the order kept detailed inventories of oats, hay, and horseshoes in castle accounts, medieval spreadsheets that showed just how calculated their warfare was. And an academic debate, some argue this administrative rigor is the real secret behind the wedge's fame, more than the geometry itself. Compared to Mongol cavalry, which relied on mobility and living off the land, the Teutonic model was heavier, slower to improvise, but far more sustained once its supply arteries held. The wedge was a blade, logistics were the arm that swung it. By the 15th century, everyone who faced the order had learned to recognize the wedge the way sailors recognize a storm cloud. You don't need to see the whole sky, just the sharp front and the tightening drumbeat of hooves. And enemies, being alive and studious, built answers. One officially recognized testing ground for those answers was the Hussite Wars, especially clashes like the Battle of Damascus in 1431 and earlier encounters, where Teutonic contingents fought alongside imperial forces against wagon forts and disciplined missile troops. Wedges found themselves charging into a wall that didn't politely break. The Teutonic army functioned in these confrontations as before heavy cavalry for the decision, infantry and crossbows in support, but now the battlefield had new furniture. The Hussite Wagenburg system forced cavalry to either loop round looking for gaps or smash into timber and hooks. The wedge's strength concentrated. Shock still mattered if a flank opened or a line wavered. When it found soft ground, it could still crack formations like a hammer on ice. But its weakness became increasingly predictable. If the enemy held a tight, well-armed front, the V-shape simply funneled riders into killing lanes of arrows, bolts, and polearms. A wedge is brilliant against fear. It's blunt against preparation. To keep it effective, wedgemen needed sharper battlefield literacy than their predecessors. They had to judge whether a line was real or bait, whether terrain would carry speed or swallow it, and when to pull back without spreading panic through the files. The best point riders were almost tacticians on horseback, not just armored athletes. A strange side fact from the period, some Polish and Lithuanian commanders reportedly trained their own heavy cavalry to form counter wedges, essentially mirror spears, so that when Teutonic points met allied points, the fight became a contest of depth and morale rather than surprise. And the academic debate here is lively. Some scholars claim the wedge was no more ordered than other European charges, while others point to Teutonic statutes and chroniclers to argue it was unusually regulated, closer to a proto-professional drill. Comparatively, French knights often charged in broader, less disciplined waves. Mongols used loose, elastic swarms that avoided head-on impact. Polish Lithuanian heavy cavalry blended shock with feigned retreats and flexible regrouping. The Teutonic wedge sat at one end of that spectrum, pure impact, pure order, and as warfare evolved, its counters evolved with it. So the wedge rides on, not as a static trick, but as a reputation that outlives the men who perfected it. In the later 15th century, the order is no longer the unquestioned shock power of the Baltic. It is a state under pressure, forced to fight wars that don't politely offer open plains and brittle infantry. The officially recognized 13 years, War 1454 to 1466, becomes the long corridor where the wedge's echo fades. At battles like Choinas in 1454, the Teutonic cavalry still lands heavy blows, and you can see the old form at work, pointed assaults aiming to split Polish formations before mercenaries and infantry lock the field. But the war is full of sieges, river crossings, and attrition forms of fighting where a cavalry spear has fewer places to be thrown. The army functions now with more hired muscle than monastic corps. Knight brothers are fewer, and mercenary cavalry competent, but less bound to order. Discipline fill out the files. Castle networks still matter, but many are contested. and supply convoys move through hostile territory that has learned to raid back. The Wedge's strength remains psychological as much as physical. When it hits a wavering militia, it still feels like the sky falling. Yet its weaknesses deepen: gunpowder weapons, better infantry pikes, and tighter combined arms. Tactics make stalled wedges more common and more costly. The more the order relies on paid troops, the harder it is to demand the kind of drill that keeps a wedge sharp. Soldiers in this era need the full skill stack: horsemanship under fire, formation discipline, and also the ability to operate in mixed fights supporting sieges, skirmishing, retreating in good order. The old single-purpose assault rider is less useful than a flexible cavalryman who can dismount, scout, or fight in broken terrain. A lesser-known side fact from the order's late period: some commanders experimented with smaller half-wedges, essentially compact strike groups meant for quick local breakthroughs, rather than grand decisive charges, an admission that the battlefield had shrunk around them. In academic debate, this is read either as tactical adaptation or as a sign of decline, masking itself as innovation. Compared to rising Eastern European cavalry styles lighter, faster, and more elastic, the Teutonic wedge begins to look like a beautiful antique tool, built for a workshop that no longer exists. Conclusion and effectiveness assessment. Looking back across the centuries, the Teutonic wedge wasn't magic. It was a disciplined answer to a specific problem. In the 13th and 14th centuries, that problem was frontier warfare against infantry-heavy opponents who lacked the armor, drill, or tactical depth to absorb a concentrated cavalry shock. In that environment, the wedge was devastatingly effective. Its core advantage was not just shape but social engineering. The order's monastic hierarchy turned individual knights into a synchronized mass. The wedge converted elite armor, fresh horses, and drilled spacing into a focused impact that could pierce lines, split morale, and create the openings infantry and crossbowmen needed to finish a fight. When it worked, it ended battles quickly and reinforced the order's legend. But effectiveness always has conditions. The wedge relied on speed, cohesion, and a target that would crack rather than hold. Once enemies learned to counter with deep formations, prepared spear fronts, field fortifications, or disciplined missile fire, the wedge shifted from a battle-ender to just one tool among many. Grunwald revealed its ceiling in a large-scale set-piece battle. The Hussite era showed how technology and fieldcraft could box it out. The 13 Years' War showed how strategic attrition and siege-heavy conflict could make it irrelevant. In short, the wedge was brilliant at delivering shock, but poor at adapting when shock was no longer decisive. If you compare it to other cavalry traditions, its place becomes clear. French-style night waves were less ordered, but more individually flexible. Mongol swarms were lighter and strategically mobile. Polish Lithuanian cavalry blended impact with deception and regrouping. The Teutonic wedge sat at the extreme of order and directness, perfect for the order's early mission. Increasingly risky as war modernized. So the final assessment is two-sided. As a formation, the wedge was among medieval Europe's most tightly managed cavalry assaults, capable of breaking armies under the right conditions. As a long-term doctrine, it was a masterpiece tied to a fading world. Its legend endures because, for a time, it truly was the spearhead of an entire state.